Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance and the lead convener of the Transform Finance Investor Network, where we look with investors and activists and community leaders at issues at the intersection of capital flows and social justice. The topic for today's presentation is how community feedback and accountability mechanisms can advance the field of impact investing. And I am delighted to be joined today by our longstanding collaborator, Joanna Levitt Cea, who's a board member and used to be the executive director at the International Accountability Project, and is now a researcher and visiting scholar at the Stanford Global Project Center. And for a main presentation by Kindra Mohr, who is the policy director at Accountability Council, and Singh, who is the Global Communities Director at Accountability Council as well. You will have noticed that we are experimenting with a new webinar platform because of the disasters of WebEx over time. So hopefully this will work out better. Please bear with us as we figure out the little kinks of moving to a new platform. But the main instructions for you, which will be different from the past, there's very limited functionality on the phone. So hopefully that will persuade people to join us by the computer. If you need to ask a question, you will see that there is a chat tab. And that question will go to everyone. You no longer have the option of just chatting with one individual on the webinar. If you would like to send a question just to the moderator or a comment, you will see that there is a questions tab. So if you press on that, you will be able to write a question that will go just to the moderator. And if you would like to make a comment live, we can enable your microphone and your camera. You just need to ask, and again, you can put it in the under the question tab. You can ask to join us. So with that, hopefully today will work better than in the last few WebEx experiences. And in the spirit of community feedback, please do let us know if this is an improvement or not, or if it makes your life harder. But let's give it a shot. So we'll get started. I'm just going to give a couple of very quick updates on our work and a second of context, and then I will turn it over to Joanna. So we've been mentioning to you this new project that we have that is now live, looking at grassroots and community-centered approaches to capital stewardship and wealth building, essentially trying to make the case that when capital flows into communities and can create the determinants and the preconditions for healthy, thriving communities, the way in which that capital is controlled, right, the process is just as important as the outcome. So we will be documenting many of the cases of community-controlled capital in the form of capital aggregation through community funds, such as Ujima Project or Democratizing Capital East Bay, and try to see what we as a community can do to support those projects, to push back on that idea that they are too small, they're too early, they take too long. Well, probably if we can adequately figure out how to support them, we can remove some of those roadblocks. So I would encourage you to get in touch with us if you would like to contribute to that research, if you have any case studies, or otherwise any approaches that we should be aware of. Again, the overarching topic there is how community governance roles over the flow of capital can contribute to healthy, thriving communities. And as you probably have also seen if you follow our work, we have now launched our cohort, which is part of our community and activist-facing side of the Transform Finance activities, led by Eric Horvath. And it's a continuation of the Institute in which we will be collaborating over a year with 4 to 6 institutions that are working on workers' rights issues, worker justice, and supporting them as they develop a capital flank to their work, essentially looking at how investors can be turned into agents of change in the context of worker justice. So we'll be looking at the role of pension funds, at the possible setting of some job quality standards, worker justice standard in private equity, some covenants around work conditions in municipal bonds and similar issues. If that is of interest, also please do reach out to us. We're always keen to learn from all the knowledge and experience that you bring into the room. And if you know of anybody else that might be interested in that work, please do share it with them. We have a couple of interesting webinars coming up. We're going to do one on March 28th on resident-owned communities in New Hampshire with John Hamilton from Vested for Growth. We haven't put the details there because in this case, since we are presenting a live investable opportunity, we might have to limit it to accredited investors or others that fall under some exemption. The issue there is that there have been a lot of private equity purchases recently of the land where manufactured home residents live, and they have generally resulted in the jacking up of prices and the displacement of folks that are already, in many cases, marginalized. And ROC USA, New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, and Vested for Growth have been working for a while in financing the purchase and the conversion of the land into those manufactured home communities to cooperative ownership by the residents in a way that pushes back against their displacement, creates an asset for them, and generally puts a cap on rent increases for folks that, again, oftentimes can't afford an increase in price and get displaced by that. And another very different one that will be coming up in April is on Islamic finance, and how the underlying principles of Islamic finance actually provide an ethical framework that is actually quite similar to many of the principles that we always talk about. And another one on how to break down the walls between the program side and the investment side of foundations, and how foundation investment officers can start looking at the program side, not just on the sort of program officer, but also the grantee side, as a source of knowledge, inspiration, and as a resource, really, for making better decisions on the investment side. If you have additional topics on this side, for our membership especially, that you would like to see featured, please let us know. With that, we'll turn to today's topic: how community feedback and accountability mechanisms can advance the field of impact investing. Now, not a surprise probably that we're tackling this, as you know, from the Transform Finance principles that you've been hearing about for 6 years. Right, we centered this notion of design, governance, and ownership by those affected by projects and investments, and having a community feedback mechanism and accountability structure and the like is quite clearly at the heart of putting into practice that principle. And the same goes around the issue of risk bearing, right? Our third principle of fairly allocating risks and returns among stakeholders. In a lot of communities, as we will see from the presentations, the risk has fallen on them of things going poorly. And if we are serious about risk being fairly allocated, there need to be mechanisms ex ante, during the investment, and exposed to make sure that their interests are adequately protected. And as we have seen over this last year, with a lot more of the mainstreaming of the conversation around power in impact investing, right? Going back to Anand Giridharadas' book, Winners Take All, Edgar Villanueva's book on decolonizing philanthropy, and similar efforts, including the Buen Vivir Fund that Joanna is a founding member of, right? Centering this question of power, who wields it, how can we not just think of investing as a way of providing capital, but really investing as a way of redefining power, redefining who wins and who loses from the decisions of those that have historically held that power. And so today's webinar is really to see how we can put into action some of these principles, looking both at the history of community feedback and accountability mechanisms, as well as the new proposal that Accountability Council is putting forward to start applying to private impact investors some of the mechanisms that have historically been the province of multilateral banks and international development context. With that, I will gladly turn it over to Joanna, who again has been a long-time collaborator and is kindly making time to be with us from Hawaii, where she resides at ungodly 7 a.m. So thank you, Joanna, for always being so supportive of us. I am going to unmute you now.
Thank you, Andrea, and good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be here today and to be able to share with all of you and hopefully learn together with folks here on what questions and ideas are coming up for you as well. Accountability is a topic dear to my heart that has been something I've been passionate about for a long time. When I was at International Accountability Project, there were lots of jokes about accountability as our middle name. But I've really gone on a whole journey with that concept over the past 10 plus years of my work, initially starting to really look at it as being on the side of accountability that is about accountability being the right thing to do and a real responsibility we have as investors in preventing unintended consequences that can actually be very serious for people's human rights. And in the past few years through my research with a colleague at the Global Project Center at Stanford, also looking at how can accountability and really robust feedback mechanisms be the smart thing to do too. How is it helping organizations achieve way more innovation and standout attention than their peers and actually be a key to more effectively solving the problems we all care about? So I want us to go a little bit on that journey today throughout the call of thinking about accountability from those various angles. And just to kind of share with you what we've put together in collaboration with my colleagues on the call today, friends from Accountability Council, another important organization in this space. We want to give you all a sense today of what is the context when we talk about accountability and impact investment. And we want to both look at recent history and some really important lessons on this topic from, in particular, the field of development aid and development finance. And we also want to talk about what is the current context in terms of possibilities and trends. And just to say one thing before we dive in here on content, if you are hoping to learn today on the call of like, here is a ready to go model that I can cookie cutter paste into my private impact investment efforts, I wish we could offer those, but the reality is the field is not there yet. So I think the challenge for you all on this call today is I'd like to really invite you to listen very attentively and creatively as you hear about past and current context. You will learn about some good practices, some lessons learned, some standards, some possible structures and mechanisms, especially from what my Accountability Council colleagues are going to share. But as a group of diverse private impact investors who are thinking about how you can play a catalytic role, I invite you to be a part of all of us who are thinking creatively about what could it look like for the forefront of impact finance to really define new ways of accountability and community feedback that get at the heart of that principle that Andrea mentioned of community ownership and the design, governance, and decision making. Because there is a real opportunity for impact investment as a field and those kind of setting the leading edge of values-aligned impact investment, not just for the field to not stumble into making the same mistakes that have happened in development aid, which is kind of a cousin field, and so to speak, of well-intentioned finance, but But how can we do much more than not replicate those mistakes? How can we really build new ways forward? So with that, yeah, we're going to talk about some of the lessons from history, challenge, and risks. So history is always an important place to start. As I said, let's take a look at some of the key experience with development aid. So just, you know, these lessons learned come from big institutional actors in the development aid sector, like the World Bank. Obviously, the World Bank is very different from the private family office or other groups that you may be running or that's on this call today. But again, like I said, just think about what are the underlying values and principles and lessons learned here, and keep a active lens on what this might mean to apply some of these in your day-to-day work. So here is a photo collage of one of the cases back in the early 90s that really brought the issue of accountability for the impacts of finance into the global stage. And I would like to say too, in this whole realm of accountability and community feedback for investment, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to millions of community members, especially in the global South. Everyday citizens, thought leaders, all kinds of people in these countries in the, what I call the majority world, the global South or developing world, who bore the brunt of, and continue to, of capital that may have good intentions on paper, but can have absolutely devastating impacts for people's everyday lives, their homes, their own dreams and development goals that they had before outside capital came in with other plans. And these are photos from a project that I imagine some of you may have heard of. This is the Sardar Sarovar Dam. Those of you who are on video can see it in the lower left. If you're calling in, it's just a huge mega dam. That was the first of the very big dams to dam up the Narmada River in India, which is one of the most sacred rivers in India. And communities, and in particular women living up and down that river, mobilized in a very, very powerful way to resist that project and to expose a lot of the corruption behind the decision-making and financing of that project. And long story short, this was kind of one of the first campaigns in the early 90s in which leadership was coming from citizens on the ground who were going to be impacted by this investment. They were very strategically connecting with activists in the US and elsewhere, where a main financier of this Sardar Sarovar Dam was the World Bank. So with activists in the US and Europe and even Japan, who had their country governments had strong voting seats on the World Bank board. And the controversy and problems around this case for people on the ground and ultimately for the World Bank led to the realization at the bank, including via advocacy with US Congress, pushing the bank to do this, to say, you know what, this is not a one-time problem that we need to react to. We actually need to create an institutional response so that we prevent situations like this from getting to such a bad point, and so that we build in some mechanisms for the financial institutions to hear from the ground what is happening. So the entity that was born out of this struggle, I mean, there are many struggles feeding into it, but Narmada and what happened with a congressional investigation into what happened on the ground there, and then the US putting pressure on the World Bank to do something, or the US wouldn't top up their financing, led to the creation of the World Bank Inspection Panel. So the inspection panel was quite a breakthrough in international law. And again, with your lens on today of saying, okay, I'm not the World Bank, we're not going to set up a whole independent office, perhaps in my family office or wherever your entity is. But again, what are some of the active principles and lessons here? The World Bank set up a semi-autonomous office within their institution, whose mandate is to field complaints from citizen groups that feel the institution is acting in violation of its safeguard policies and its mandate. So the inspection panel has been active for over 25 years now and has fielded complaints from all over the world. It was the first entity like this in an international institution that could directly be activated by private citizens on the ground and trigger a investigation process that would be taken to the board of a multilateral organization. When you hear next from my colleagues at Accountability Council, they'll be sharing more about some of the structures of different institutional accountability mechanisms like this. But for now, suffice to say that the birth of the World Bank Inspection Panel in the early 90s led to a proliferation of entities like this within other international financial institutions. A trend that I want to flag for us that does feel very relevant for impact investment is, when the possibility of the panel was first coming up, a lot of people were like, wait, why does development aid need to have this? Development aid is a good thing. We're supposed to help people. We're supposed to create development. Why do we need to have a panel, showing us when we're doing wrong? But ultimately, there was a shift and agreement within the institution that sometimes comes and goes still, but to say, no, this is actually enhancing our ability to fulfill that mission. And this is part of our ability to do that well and responsibly. And I flag that because I think all of us are aware, often in impact investment today, the question of, wait, I don't need to build in any accountability mechanisms because the whole purpose of this capital is to help. So I don't think we need to be looking at, potential human rights impacts. We will hear from my colleagues about how impact projects as well can go really wrong. But again, I think the principle there is thinking about it not as in opposition to the fact that capital exists to create positive impact, but recognizing that it can be a very powerful accompaniment to helping that work better. In my slide here, there's a image of a book called Demanding Accountability. As the inspection panel and other kind of sister entities have been active for decades now, there's been a lot of lessons learned around what is created when communities go through a complaint process, some of the challenges of actually making change on the ground. And very interestingly, one of the biggest kinds of changes enacted by cases going through these accountability mechanisms is not only change on the ground, hopefully stopping or righting wrongs, but also there tend to be reverberating changes in policy at the institutions, because these cases lift up and make more visible problems that the financier needs to think about at an institutional level. Seeing some great questions there about how these panels work, and I think I might kick that can down the road to my colleagues. You'll hear more from them, but I can say in a nutshell, communities submit complaints, that triggers the investigation. The inspection panel puts together an independent team of people to investigate what's happening on the ground, and they make a recommendation on a way forward that they submit to the World Bank. So one of the reasons too in sharing this context today is, so I mentioned a lot of these cases have led to policy change, right, and have led to institutional change. And there's a whole body of best practice around accountability for finance that has emerged not only from these mechanisms, but from the whole kind of combination of efforts in international institutions and international law, in corporate social responsibility, in social organizations working on the ground, about what are key principles that must be upheld to make accountability mechanisms work well. Also, a particular kind of entity that also kind of proliferated after the inspection panel is not only accountability mechanisms within institutions, but also project-based grievance mechanisms on the ground, and kind of offices or project-specific entities set up for community members and other stakeholders to to go to when they have complaints, concerns, issues. So that's something we'll be hearing more about from my colleagues as well. So I'm going to, for now, end the historical look back there and say, so that, you know, the inspection panel was created in the early 90s. What are some of the very big changes and challenges and opportunities since then? When these first institutional financial accountability mechanisms came up, the global financial landscape was very different. For projects like a big dam in India in the early 90s, it was very, very likely that the World Bank was financing it, or that one of the big multilateral development banks were there. They were kind of the only game in town if you wanted to do a big mega project. Since then, we have had a huge exponential increase in the amount of financial entities that are doing project finance within development aid, but also private banking, and in the field of impact investment. I mean, as you all know, many, many different actors call themselves impact investors, you know, not from institutional financiers to private investors. And that also is part of all the kinds of capital flowing around the world for supposedly positive change benefits. And as there are more and more sources of capital, it is a big challenge of how we create accountability mechanisms for all of those, or that apply in different ways. And at the same time, opportunity is all the new kinds of tech and interconnection that exist globally. There's new opportunities for more distributed kinds of mechanisms that aren't based fundamentally within an institution or at the project level, but are actually distributed and built around stakeholders. And I'll just share a couple quick examples of that and then hand to my colleagues to talk more about some best practices from community-based feedback mechanisms. This is one project of International Accountability Project, and in which a number of partners are involved, including Accountability Council. But it's that kind of distributed mechanism I mentioned. It's not based in any institution. It is a global network of groups and active tech that is daily uploading information about new projects that are being approved that may have real impacts on people's human rights and environment, and activating corresponding groups near these projects to upload real-time data and information about what's happening with the projects. It has become such a powerful base of information that even the development banks themselves are looking at what is happening on this. It's called the early warning system. So something like this is leveraging the possibilities in a more interconnected and distributed world to bring together citizen-based info to hold projects accountable for what's happening and kind of empower people on the ground to take action with the info they need, rather than just relying on one mechanism that kind of works in concert with those things. That's more on the early warning system. There's a project I'm learning about through my research that is a new startup based out of the Niger Delta called Sela that is using a blockchain-powered platform to have community verification of impact be the trigger that enables next tranche of project finance to be released. So it's a very interesting project, directly like combining community monitoring tech with a new financial flow platform. And with the Sela project and some of the other ones I'm looking at in my research, groups have really taken the notion of accountability much farther than something that happens after the fact, but actually something that they want to build in throughout the project cycle, and being really thoughtful about how they source feedback from the very start. So it influences the design, it influences the strategy, and it influences the outcomes. And I'll share a bit more in just closing minutes at the end, but about how incorporating and embedding accountability and feedback in that way can be a very smart strategy for making impact more effective. So in sum, before I hand off to my colleagues to hear from them next, I think as impact investors, it's important for us to think about accountability and feedback from people on the ground as doing a number of things. This, I guess, the meta point is, at the end of the day, the impact we're trying to create is the people who should be most benefiting from it. If they don't have a strong voice in shaping what happens, then what are we all doing this for? And by building in strong mechanisms for accountability and feedback, we prevent risk in a number of ways of problems getting out of hand. We also, I think, particularly in impact investment right now, it can be a little bit of a Wild West of everyone. You can say whatever you want to say about what impact you're creating on the ground. There's not like a standard, practice for verifying what is said. So strong accountability and feedback mechanisms can actually be a way for different asset managers, impact investors, others to really stand out in a noisy field and show when we say XYZ is happening on the ground, we can really back it up. Here's the ways that it is actively proved and verified by many people. And finally, as we may have time to talk about at the end, this phenomenon of breakout innovation that I've been looking at in the research at Stanford around how feedback can actually be the very, very smart thing to do. And with that, I'm going to hand it to my colleagues at Accountability Council to talk more about some very important mechanisms and examples we can learn from.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and I look forward to your remarks after Kindra and Sarah have a chance to present. Again, looks like the audience got it, so there's the possibility to use the chat function and to use the questions function. And we've also added a poll to experiment with that. Again, unfortunately, this is a bit of a self-selected audience, but it does ask whether you believe that private self-identifying impact investors should hold themselves accountable to the communities that they affect. It's something that we kind of presume to be the case, but I imagine evidence seems to indicate that that is still not quite the mainstream view within the self-identified, self-defined impact investing world overall. So on the presentation now, we're going to dig into a little bit that issue of accountability. And I would like everybody on the line to really start thinking about how this can be put into practice, what it would look like for impact investors to play a role in defining, implementing, and ensuring the broad adoption of a community feedback and accountability mechanism. And there will be time for you to share your reflections on that directly as we after Kindra and Sarah have a chance to present. So with that, thank you again, Joanna. I'm turning it over to Kindra Mohr, Policy Director of Accountability Council, and Sarah Singh, Global Communities Director of Accountability Council.
Thanks, Andrea, and really do appreciate the opportunity to be presenting on these issues. It's a pleasure. Really, thank you for hosting us on this platform, and thanks to Joanna for her opening thoughts. Just maybe a little bit of a background here on Accountability Council for those of you who don't know about us and our work. So our mission is really to amplify the voices of communities to protect their human rights and environment. We are a nonprofit legal organization. We do not litigate in courts, but instead specialize in the use of what we call non-judicial accountability offices or community feedback tools, community feedback mechanisms that have been created specifically to address community grievances and receive feedback and to establish a feedback loop for institutional improvement. And over the past 10 years of our operation, our team has partnered with nearly 40 communities globally to defend their rights and to seek remedy for investments that have gone wrong. Our approach specifically has been developed as a rights-based approach to ensure that marginalized people, particularly women and girls, are included as full participants in community strategies seeking accountability and really defining their path forward in development and in the investments that are shaping their lives. And our team does this through really 3 different programs. The first is through a research program that looks at trends and has studied the cases that have come up through these feedback offices. As I'll mention later, there have been about 1,300 cases through these offices over the past 25 years, and looking at where complaints are filed and where they aren't filed, and what sectors are involved, who's financing the projects, and so forth. And our second program is our communities program, and Sarah will speak a bit about her work and experience as one of our communities directors, and what they do, very much a direct services sort of a sort of function of working directly with communities, helping them file or draft complaints, helping them design strategies maybe outside of the complaint process where they could actually seek redress and accountability for adverse impacts on their livelihoods. And lastly, our policy program, which I head in Washington, and what we try to do is really to work to ensure that those feedback offices are transparent and independent, fair, accessible, effective for those who use them and for those who house them. And we work actively through a number of advocacy angles to do so. And we also are striving to create these offices and create these tools for investors that don't have them already. So that leads me really to kind of our work in the impact investing space. And what we've learned over the past few years in engaging with impact investors is that there is an awareness that there could be adverse impacts of their investing, but not a lot of clarity about how to deal with that and how to really measure it. And I know there's a lot of work going on with Impact Management Project and IRIS and a number of other really strong tools and ideas that are out there. And we're entering this conversation working with people who are very much interested in getting community feedback. And I think, just as Joanna said, we may not be there yet, but we feel like the trend is moving in that direction to really be more proactive and deliberative in the investment choices that are being made. And in those conversations with impact investors, we've really seen that this could be not only a tool that's drilled into current due diligence practices as kind of an iterative approach for improving investment decision making, but also a way to connect more deeply with communities, to understand what sorts of projects and investments would most benefit them while also benefiting the investment community, and to really ensure that whether it's meeting SDG commitments or if it's just about a very specific area of impact that an investor is looking for, that this is truly one of the key ways of doing it. It's reaching out and developing the relationships with communities, learning not only what works best for them, but how to resolve issues and negative impacts as they come up, so that investors really are looking holistically at their net impact and understanding how to minimize those adverse effects while maximizing the positive benefits to the investment community as well as the communities on the ground. So really starting from that point in these conversations that we've had, it stems from, like I said before, 10 years of experience working with communities that have faced challenging environments when investments are at their front door. And we've learned this specifically through the accountability frameworks within the development finance world, but also through our engagement with private and commercial banks and bilateral development institutions as well. And we just wanted to really highlight a case study for you to kind of ground this conversation in reality, knowing that anytime an investor is working in an area where there are vulnerable communities, whether it's an agribusiness in Africa or opportunity zones in the United States, those risks are very real and they're not going anywhere. And as the impact investing field expands and grows and seeks to grow more, those risks will also grow. So we're presenting ideas, and hopefully in a conversation with you all, how do we address that risk in a proactive, community-centered way? And I'll turn to Sarah now to discuss a little bit about what we've seen in the development finance space that also involved private actors investing in what was supposed to be a very community-oriented and beneficial project for communities in Liberia. Sarah?
Yeah, hi everybody. It's really wonderful to join this conversation and be part of this. And as Kindra mentioned, I co-direct our communities program. And so that means for the last 7 years, I've had the immense pleasure of working directly with communities all over the world who are facing harm from projects that were supposed to be benefiting them. So I have a lot of experience in what can go wrong and also in some possible solutions. And I want to share just one example right now, which I'll acknowledge up front is an extreme example, but it's also an impact investment. This is a project that started as an individual impact investment in Liberia and later attracted development finance, which is part of what allowed it to grow bigger. But I think it's representative of a lot of the ways in which these projects can go wrong. So this was I worked with these communities directly for several years. The picture on the screen, for those who can't see it, is women gathering to speak with me about some of the disproportionate harm that they suffered from this project. And this was a project meant to address really huge needs in post-conflict Liberia. It was started with a lot of good intent. It was supposed to help rejuvenate smallholder farms that had been left untended and were really rapidly losing productivity due to the conflict in Liberia, where no one had been able to work on the farms for many years. It was meant to alleviate Liberia's energy crisis by developing a power plant that would be connected to Liberia's grid. And it was supposed to provide good employment, which was desperately needed and is really still desperately needed in Liberia. So it was a biomass project where they were going to cut down old rubber trees that were losing their productivity, replant them, and that way rejuvenate the farms, use the wood chips to power a to-be-developed power plant, and yeah, it provided a lot of employment. And I've spoken with the primary investor. I have no doubt that he had really good intentions. But unfortunately, the project failed in really all the ways that a project possibly could. It produced a loss for all of the investors, a really substantial loss. The power plant never got off the ground. The farms ended up destroyed. The new rubber trees were either not planted or weren't tended properly and died. There were disproportionate impacts on women, including subjecting them to sexual abuse. There were serious workplace injuries from, it was a forestry project when you're talking about cutting down trees, so really devastating injuries that left some workers unable really to continue this type of work. And ultimately the whole thing collapsed and left, and there's kind of big buildings and stuff just sitting there ghostly with nothing happening. So why did all of that happen? I mean, there are a lot of reasons. Liberia is not an easy country in which to work. But aside from that, there was really a failure to consult with these community members to find out what the best way would be to move forward a project like this. And then a failure to accept and address feedback as information started to come out suggesting that the project was not working the way it was supposed to. So there were many attempts as this project went forward to try to reach out to the investors and let them know that there were serious problems. And I feel like though that feedback was not wanted and wasn't responded to, wasn't addressed, and then that's the result that you ended up with. And so I think it's it is an extreme example, but it's also easy to imagine similarly other projects spiraling out of control when you don't consult with the people and when you don't accept the feedback that they try to give as the project moves forward. And I will turn it back to Kindra to kind of talk more about that connection and relationship to impact investing.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That's always a disheartening story, and every time we talk about it, it always really to me brings back the need for community-centered strategies and approaches to investing. And even though, as you said, it is a bit of an extreme example, so to speak, what we're seeing that even if, maybe it's not going to look like this in every case, but if there are negative impacts, the investor should, number one, be aware, and number two, mitigate, and three, address it as soon as possible and ensure that they can prevent future harm in their investment decisions and strategies going forward. And as I said before, really any time that you're facing a vulnerable population and not necessarily thinking through to the range of possible impacts and understanding that there may be unintentional impacts even with the best due diligence processes, what are some ways to deal with it proactively? Like, let's not let another Buchanan Renewables situation occur, and not only because there's a moral argument there, but there's also the business case. And I think what we've learned in conversations with investors, whether from kind of your private equity side to the family offices to big, philanthropic institutions, intent doesn't necessarily matter here. Of course, adverse impacts can happen regardless of intent is essentially what I'm saying. And, trying to avoid it is not necessarily good enough. And, developing the tools, kind of a fit for purpose method and strategy for addressing harm and being accountable to the field and to the communities on the ground is really, we see as the one way for the sustainability of impact investing. I mean, there's a lot of excitement and hope around it right now, but also in these discussions with leaders in the field, recognizing that it will only take a few headlines to really disrupt and call into question the intent in the so-called goodness of the field as it goes forward. So really just want to underscore that this is it's not just about sending warning signals and saying get ahead of this and your business will do better if you do. Of course that's true, but at the same time it's about how do you create lasting value, lasting solutions, and that connection with the communities on the ground that are really the core or at the center of the entire design, or at least that's where we see it where it should be. So moving on from kind of the net impact and understanding that negative consequences really flow into that. We also wanted just to draw attention and kind of come back to what Joanna said. This is based on the tools that we're seeing are useful, are based in kind of the experience of development finance and how can we really learn from what's gone right and wrong in development finance and kind of build it into kind of the evolution of the impact investing field. And as Joanna mentioned, the creation of the inspection panel in 1993 really was a revolutionary way for communities to access these institutions that were far away. There wasn't a lot of transparency involved, but as more and more people learned about the mechanisms, and I think someone, Cassia, may have mentioned, it's about transparency and learning and knowing how to access these mechanisms that makes a huge difference. It really is, kind of centered around, okay, how do we address the negatives and how do we ensure that the projects can go forward without negative consequences? We really see that framing as being critical to the growth of impact investing. How do we build that in before an Armada happens or before a Buchanan Renewables happens? How do we put that together in a fit for purpose mechanism or tools for impact investors? So with kind of the inspection panel inception, there have been almost two dozen or more similar feedback offices that have been created across the development finance space. Those are really the major ones. And what they look like kind of differs depending on location and size of the investor and the scope of where they operate. But they tend to have really three primary tools. And the first is a compliance review tool, where the office or the staff, as Joanna mentioned, with say the inspection panel, they will conduct an independent review as to whether or not the institution complied with its own rules or standards when those are in place, which is pretty common in development finance. The second tool would be kind of dispute resolution, where the office would hire independent mediators to facilitate a negotiated dialogue between the parties and help them and guide them through a process to reach a mutually satisfying agreement, so that the community's grievances are addressed. And the third function really is what we call an advisory function or a learning function, where this office plays a proactive role in kind of looking over the trends, the case trends, the grievance trends, the feedback, and provides kind of some learnings to the investor so that it's an iterative feedback process, and the investor can understand better, like it's not just a one-off case by case. Maybe they're saying the same issues come up in different locations or in different investments. So this office really helps them put those trends together and learn how to grow from that. And so what we're seeing is that a variety of these tools could be very helpful for impact investors. I would say particularly dispute resolution for communities that are really want to enter into a dialogue process and reach that kind of that balanced kind of outcome where there's a level playing field. They're having conversations with investors or the parties involved, the implementers, whatever it may be, and they can all together kind of reach that sustainable solution without necessarily going to the headlines and protesting and derailing investments and projects as they're underway. And I think for us, the dispute resolution tool has been particularly enlightening, and in the impact investing space, where there isn't necessarily a set of auditable standards for a compliance review that may exist at development finance institutions right now. Of course, that could change over time. But that said, we have seen, and for those of you who don't have the slides in front of you, if you're on the phone, kind of coming back to what I had said before, at the moment we have collected data on nearly 1,300 cases that have emerged from these feedback offices, ranging from different geographies, different sectors and a wide range of projects from kind of education reform to road projects to transmission line projects. So, you know, a variety of issues at stake kind of on the project side, but also, you know, it's a matter of where the project went wrong. We're seeing as far as trends, you know, that it's labor rights abuses, that it's consultation problems, that communities were never consulted, that it's ignoring kind of indigenous peoples issues and land rights issues. So we're really seeing kind of across the development landscape a number of kind of issues that could have been addressed if communities were more actively engaged and brought into the development projects. Of these, just to highlight for those who don't see, 11% of those 1,300 cases have gone through dispute resolution, leading to 77 agreements to address the harm, and 16% of them have been investigated. So, you know, we've been a part of just a sliver of these cases, but have seen, you know, success kind of on the range of working with nomadic herders in Mongolia to farmers in Haiti, and really wanted just to highlight one of those success stories with you today to kind of let you see how a dispute resolution process can work when there are a variety of actors in a relatively vulnerable context in Haiti. I'll turn to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Kindra. So yeah, as Kindra said, we want to share with you a success story and maybe a little bit of kind of practical understanding of what we mean when we say dispute resolution and what this might look like. Of course, dispute resolution can cover a lot of things, but generally in this context, we're talking about voluntary mediations that involve a neutral facilitator and whomever the parties are to the conflict, and they come together voluntarily to arrive at a mutually agreeable solution and path forward. And that can be a daunting undertaking when you're talking about a huge project and really vulnerable communities and all of the power imbalances that I see people talking about on the chat. But it's not impossible, and it can be really, really successful and really transformative and empowering for communities. So with that, I'll share quickly a case study from Haiti where we just had a recent success. So this project, the Caracol Industrial Park, was a post-earthquake reconstruction project. So again, an example of huge need and really good intentions. This was a garment manufacturing facility that was developed in the north of Haiti, was meant to draw population away from Port-au-Prince, where the biggest damage was, and try to provide jobs. And of course, we can debate whether that's a good way to do that or not. But the point was the people involved were trying to do something helpful in Haiti. It was a project developed and promoted by the Inter-American Development Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Clinton Foundation, and the Haitian government, among others. And there were, I've seen in the chat, a number of people talking about the need for upfront due diligence. That was for sure true in this project. And although there were due diligence rules in place, it really failed to properly talk to communities when they were doing their due diligence. So as just one example, project documents early on claimed that the land was devoid of habitation or intensive cultivation, when in reality, the land taken for this park was some of the most fertile agricultural land in the area, and it was being actively cultivated by 422 farmers and their families. So those farmers were displaced with only a few days' notice. They lost income, food security, with all sorts of terrible results: inability to feed their children, inability to put their children in school. We got involved 5 years after the displacement. There have been a lot of organizing and efforts to get redress and to fix this situation through channels involving mostly the Haitian government, and those have been largely unsuccessful. And so when we got involved 5 years later, people were still struggling to get enough food to put their kids in school. There were disproportionate impacts on women, including reports of increased gender-based violence. Luckily, the Inter-American Development Bank has one of these community feedback and accountability offices that Kindra was talking about. It's called MISI, and we helped farmers file a complaint in January of 2017 to MISI. MISI accepted the complaint and activated their dispute resolution function. They hired a neutral facilitator, helped establish rules and an agenda for the mediation process, and brought the parties to the table. So this was a mediation between these Haitian farmers, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Haitian government. And it was not always a smooth process, but it was ultimately a really successful and transformative one. After 18 months in the mediation process, the parties signed an agreement in December of last year that is meant to restore the livelihoods of these farmers. The agreement includes a number of points, but in really brief summary form, about 100 farmers will get new land and technical support, and others have a choice between getting modern agricultural equipment and training, getting small business development support, or getting vocational training. Every family also has the opportunity, if they want it, of having a job at the park, and that will include some specialized roles, not just sewing jobs. And finally, each family gets education kits for their children. So the picture, for those of you who can't see it, is the collective of farmers voting on this, voting yes in support of this final agreement. And we're now in the stages of implementing it. So I know we're running short on time, but I hope this gives an example of the really practical solutions that can be negotiated even after years of conflict and problems and struggles over a project. And I would just say that the key takeaways that I think are important for impact investors from a project and a situation like this is the need for due diligence and early appropriate community consultations to avoid a lot of these problems in the first place. The need to check in on all aspects of the project, even aspects that might be outside of your control. So in this case, the government managed the resettlement process, but it still caused harm and caused reputational harm to the people who were involved in this, even if they weren't directly responsible for how resettlement went. And then finally, the need for feedback and accountability and the transformative role that a feedback and accountability office can play in a situation like this where something does go wrong. I'll turn it back to you, Kindra.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and maybe just to move into kind of the practical implications or what this could look like for the impact investment community. While there's no set model of what a community feedback mechanism could look like in the impact investing space, we realize it really needs to be fit for purpose, community-centered, and really, owned by the investment community itself. And in our past discussions, particularly with Paul Brest at the Stanford Law and Policy Lab, some direction on this has been emerging. As the slide says, we've discussed with a number of folks about where something like this could be housed. It could be at an existing network hub. It could be a standalone team for a small group of like-minded investors, or it could be completely independent altogether. And really, we're seeing, also in our conversations that data collection and really using technology is going to be an important element of this, of not only collecting information, but being able to respond to it, and the grievances that come up, or the positive feedback that may come up. So the innovations at Acumen, or feedback labs, or Keystone Accountability, really like understanding and doing deep dives into data, and how lean data or other sorts of platforms could really provide a good avenue for investors in this regard, and how we could team up with with them on this. Again, like this could be a number of different functions that are built into it, from data collection to, okay, so now we have the data, we know what the problems are, how do we deal with it? Do you want to do a dispute resolution process? Like, and if not, what else is what is another option? And I think when talking with Andrea before the webinar, understanding that, accountability means, so many things, but for us, you can only have this type of accountability in this field if you have the community feedback. Like you have to be tailoring, your investment decisions to the communities that you're intending to benefit here. And without having this element or this feedback loop from them, you're really missing an element of the broader concept of accountability, and where this field is going to need to develop the tools and really to underscore kind of the right methods and the right tools to grow in a way that's beneficial to the communities and all the stakeholders involved. So really, regardless of this uptake modality, whether it's a variety of functions or if it's located in a network hub, if its focus is just specific geography or a specific investment type or theme, I think as Cassia has also mentioned, really it's about awareness, making sure the communities are able to access the mechanism, that they can provide real-time feedback in a safe way, and that, of course, there's some response at the other end, right? So it's not just like their grievances or feedback are going into the ether, that there's actually like a process for addressing them fairly and effectively, and that there's the learning that goes into the entire investment cycle. And if the process really fails to incorporate these, investors will miss the value of the whole feedback loop, leaving not only unmitigated risks, but really missing the whole learning that could help the field evolve. And of course, as we know, this mechanism or these tools aren't going to eliminate risk entirely, but we see it as really proactive and very progressive way of handling them in a sustainable manner. And just would really love to kind of transition the conversation back to Joanna and hear from you all about your thoughts about this. How could this work? What are the obstacles? What opportunities are you seeing? Or perhaps maybe what you're doing that already encompasses these elements of community feedback that I think the rest of the audience here would really love to hear and learn from. So maybe I'll just turn it to Joanna now to close us off.
Sure, thank you, Kindra and Sarah. What are the different realms of action that we're talking about here for us as private impact investors who want to do the right thing and the smart thing on this issue? We've heard some really important context and examples from Accountability Council, and I think I'm going to offer kind of my own framework on how I think about approaching this issue of like action we can take as investors. And I'm going to ask you all, I'm really enjoying the active chat and appreciate how much people are cultivating this as a community, that we're sharing what's useful to us. So please keep that going. But I see kind of three realms of action that we've talked about across this call today that each of us can do. One is, as investors who want to make a difference, we have first a responsibility to learn about and, where possible, sign on to existing standards and mechanisms that are greater than our little office or investing entity that we can be a part of. So one, this is learning about a lot of the good standards that are out there and best practices that others have learned. People have chatted some today, and Kindra and Sarah shared briefly at the end about an exciting mechanism Accountability Council is exploring with Stanford Law School that may be an independent mechanism that private investors can opt into in the future. So I think the theme across my three areas of action is don't do this alone, right? So don't totally recreate the wheel yourself. See what else you can learn about and draw from. And then for me, the second realm is do a co-creative process. So what do I mean by this? If really, like, what is the root of a lot of these problems around accountability? The root is a very small group of people locked away in a room somewhere deciding something that impacts a lot of people without a lot of other people having access or power to influence what happens there. So my personal take is the best way we come up with a solution to counter that is by making sure we don't use the master's tools to, I'm going to mix metaphors here. I want to say, if you're trying to correct a consolidation of power issue, don't come up with the solution in a very consolidated way. You can aim for, okay, I have learned about the key values and principles that my investing entity wants to fulfill. We want to fulfill this first design principle of transformative finance. We want to fulfill principles of doing really strong early diligencing to make sure we avoid problems. We want to do all these things. Now I'm going to, instead of coming up with this myself or a small group of us, I'm going to really reach out to the different kinds of actors who touch and are a part of in some way the investment activities that we do and support, and gather their ideas on what would be a most meaningful way to build in really robust feedback. And I'm going to come back to this point in a second here. And then I think the exciting third area that we can do today is like look at, based on the principles we want to uphold and the creative way we want to get there, what are some additive tools out there that we might bring in to help us? I mentioned the Sela platform that I've been learning about. I saw someone chatted about labor voices. There's a lot of different tools out there for using distributed data and other ways to kind of reinforce some of the avenues that have been available historically for accountability. And maybe I'll say just a bit about some specific practices for co-creating ways forward. But I'd actually like to, before I do that, for us to take 1 minute, and everyone who's on this webinar who has chat function, can I ask us while we're here to take 1 minute here in silent reflection and chat in what is something that has you, or perhaps a close, if you are very new at this, is there something you know that has been useful to a peer of how you have built in concept of accountability and community feedback in some way in your investing work? What has been a step you've taken or a resource you've used that has been useful to you for making your investment live this value? And let's take 1 minute. I see people starting. Thank you very much, folks. Keep chatting. Great. And for people on the phone, we have some chats about bringing community members onto the steering committee or oversight group of the project. Absolutely. That was a big innovation we did too with Buen Vivir Fund. We have instead of an investment committee, we have a members assembly. Great. People chatting about identifying at the front end a score on the likelihood of harm. That is definitely a useful practice that a number of investment entities have used of on the front end kind of categorizing how risky a project is to make sure the mechanisms apply appropriately. Let's get a couple more useful ideas up in the chat. Great. And just to share out, so a good point here on partnering with local organizations that have community knowledge and connections. that is so key. I'll say to any of the additive tech tools out there that are really proving valuable, they are the ones that have put equal or more thought into the kind of almost the connective tissue between actual people and groups on the ground as they have on the tech platform. The tech by itself isn't that valuable unless you have a really robust, workable way, often based on strong relationships of real people and groups on the ground input. Working with community foundations, great. There's so much we can do around capital, of grant capital and impact investment, but leveraging the different institutional perspectives that different kind of peers and funders have. Great. Funding different roles within your staff team to lead diligence and feedback efforts. And a very good question from Ashley, which this comes up for many, many of us, is how do we diligence the info? Like, how do we know information we're getting from the ground is trustworthy? How do you know the community organization you may be working with is actually a reflective and like authentic representation of many voices on the ground? There is not an easy answer to this question, but again, a lot of the distributed mechanisms happening today are trying to counter for that by making sure it's not just one, but many. And I'll mention one more and then bring it back to us. But I see Delilah mentioning the IFC performance standards. So in the first point I mentioned of what are existing standards out there that are useful, that a lot of people have put thought into already. One is definitely the set of performance standards from the International Finance Corporation. Some are controversial in some aspects because a lot of people have input on them and wanted some things stronger or weaker, but it's a good representative of the different kind of realms that we need to be thinking about around accountability. And if there's interest, I'm happy to say more in a bit about some of the specific practices we can use in co-creative processes to come up with these answers. But I think I may first hand back to Andrea to ground us back into some of the overarching principles here. Uh-oh, and Andrea dropped off. He got kicked off again. Oh no, okay, I got it, Andrea, don't worry.
I could leap in with one
Sure, please.
piece of advice about this question of how do we know if what you're getting is correct. I don't have a magic bullet answer for that, but as someone who works directly with communities who are harmed by projects, I would say that really often when communities are trying to give that feedback, people ignore them. So part of it is just about staying open-minded and listening. If you start to get contrary information to what you're being told, investigate it, take it seriously, try to figure out what's going on, and maybe triangulate. Like, if the main organization you're relying on for information just dismisses claims that are coming out, that in itself is a red flag and kind of means maybe you should talk to someone else and find out what they think. So I see a lot of communities who have tried really hard to give feedback in less official ways before they actually take a formal step of filing a complaint, and are often feeling dismissed and unheard. So I think that's one of the best things anyone can do, is just continue to be self-critical, to receive feedback and to correct course as needed, rather than kind of setting a path and then sticking to it no matter what.
Yes, I do think that's a really important one, and it actually speaks to mindset, which in the research I've been co-leading at the Global Project Center is often one of the key distinguishing features of groups who are achieving breakout innovation via very strong feedback cycles throughout, of going in with enough of a mindset to be open that feedback could be the smart thing to do and not just the right thing to do. And then often going through a process of experiencing that reinforces that mindset. And kind of, it's like a positive feedback cycle itself that makes people more and more likely to embed feedback throughout and do it deeper each time because they're seeing the value come out of it in doing smarter impact. And maybe just one more note about ways that people are doing co-creation to come up with meaningful new ways of accountability mechanisms and feedback for investment. One of the most important practices of groups who are doing this in ways that get to impact that stands out from its peers in a number of ways. I won't go into how we're gauging what makes it stand out right now, but in the research I'm a part of, is those who are doing the kind of co-design of their investment in a way that the priorities and agenda and focus of the investment are themselves co-designed before we even get to the mechanisms of if that investment goes off the rails, what is the problem we put in place? So kind of first engaging people in setting the very foundation of what we're trying to do, and almost like prototyping and testing assumptions of whether the sought priorities are indeed the ones that are resonating most strongly with the designated beneficiaries. And some of the most important and effective ways people are bringing folks together is via co-design processes that intentionally bring into a design circle very different perspectives across the investment ecosystem, and that manage across those differences well. And I can put a link in chat in a bit on to an article that shows some of successful practices and cases of groups doing that. And the last thing I'll say on this is as groups invest the front end time, and it is sometimes time and money, right, to do this kind of front end planning and co-design of both your impact agenda and your kind of feedback mechanisms, it ends up being a very powerful strategy for de-risking. It de-risks not just the kind of potential disastrous impacts we heard about today, but one of the most kind of subtle and yet important ways is it de-risks a subpar outcome, because it helps test assumptions and eliminate off the bat ideas that wouldn't really have worked or totally have flown or resonated, because you're testing early and often with folks involved how the investment thesis and kind of mechanisms around it can be most effective. So it puts that time in the front end of how you can optimize different impact and return objectives of the work. And maybe just to open it up to a few more questions from chat. I know where Andrea's having, there's some technical difficulties with getting back on the webinar, so we may wrap us up today ourselves here, but did want to make sure we open to questions beyond the prompt I just shared earlier, but any other questions for my colleagues at Accountability Council or on this topic of accountability and feedback for private impact investment.
And Joanna, I wanted just to throw out there, if this is in people's minds right now, is just kind of the tools that we've discussed that are available through these community feedback offices, this compliance review versus the dispute resolution versus kind of the advisory function, the learning function. I'm wondering if the audience could indicate maybe what they think based on, of course, our very high level discussion of them. What would be useful? Like, what sorts of functions does that resonate? Would those things be useful in a setting, in an office like this, or whatever kind of platform we would suggest? What of those tools seems to make the most sense for the work that they're doing and thinking about. I would love to hear feedback on that, if that's top of mind for those in the audience.
And also just a plug in our last few minutes here. Thank you, Nancy, for that great chat. That is an awesome initiative. I know about that too. If others can put in chat now actual models you're enacting today around community accountability and feedback, actual models or practices you're doing now. And we've had a number of good chats today about different mechanisms around worker rights and voice. There's actually a lot of really interesting work around supply chain investment that has happened on the accountability front. Thank you, Lindsay, for sharing about worker-driven social responsibility model.
Thanks for your comment, Luke, on LPs. That's also something that we've heard elsewhere of, having them in part drive this conversation, particularly in the private equity space.
Great. And folks sharing about things that they're trying with different kinds of representation on investment committee and ownership within the fund. That is something we tried with Buen Vivir Fund as well. And I think it'll be worthwhile to compile a number of the resources shared via chat today, both on new thinking around this and concrete models. And I know we're texting here with Andrea that we are going to wrap it up, and Transform Finance is very much interested in supporting moving this conversation moving forward. I know there's a couple webinars in the works already about specific tools and new tools that we can bring to work around diligence and impact verification by citizens. Thank you, Ashley, too, for mentioning human-centered design. That's a big one for me of accountability, really, at the end of the day, is very linked to doing good design on the front end. And we have a mention of some of the anchor collaboratives at the Democracy Collaborative. Yes, accountability is also linked to thinking about democracy differently. So I know today has been a bit around big ideas and practices and possibilities. And really appreciate everyone's active chatting and sharing. And I know Transform Finance will be continuing to move this forward, including looking at very concrete tools and applications we can do across different kinds of private impact investment actors. And for today, oh wait, message coming in here. We're going to wrap up to keep this on time. But please, from Andrea, please be in touch and know that this is a call to action from all of us here, actually, to join us in thinking about what accountability and impact investment can and should look like. Here you have contact info for Kurt and being in touch. And please note, too, that Transform Finance will be looking at the domestic piece that Lynn Hoey brought up in that chat. And that, I just thank you, everyone, for putting in the time to talk about this topic today. It really is at the center of whether impact investment is actually a force for good or not. And in today's world, it is very, very frequently completely overlooked or omitted in impact investment. And so I appreciate everyone for putting the time and thought into being here and for continuing the conversation together on how we can make not just what we invest in, quote, good, but also the how of how we do it really transformative to make sure that best of intentions turn into real positive change on the ground. So thank you, everyone, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.